Good afternoon and welcome to day 2 of our Teagasc Virtual Pig Week. My name is Louise Clark, Specialist Pig Advisor based in Ballyhaise, County Cavan, and I will be your host for today. As outlined in our introduction yesterday, the focus of today's session will be on key husbandry practices in pig production, looking particularly in the areas of farrowing, weaning and feeding. Today's format will consist of a number of short video clips by Teagasc researchers and farm staff, which will be followed by a question and answer session at the end to our panel. You, the viewer, can ask questions by typing the questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will ask the panel those questions on your behalf. So on our panel today, we will be joined shortly by Michael McKeown, Specialist Pig Advisor based in Moorpark, and also by Dr. Peadar Lawler, Principal Research Officer in the Teagasc Pig Department and also based in Moorpark. So to get today's proceedings underway, we will play the first video clip where Aisling Holmes, pig technician in the Moorpark unit, spoke to Orla Kinane about some of the key husbandry practices around farrowing and the protocols of inducing sows on the Moorpark unit. And just a reminder before the video starts that if you have questions as the video is playing, you can type them questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen.
I wonder, could you just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your role here at Moorpark?
Yeah, so I am one of the pig technicians here in Moorpark, and my main role is data collection. So that is from making sure that the data is accurately recorded outside in the unit to being correctly put into our system here on site. The system on site that we use currently is PigChamp. And by making sure all that data is correct, I can stand over reports that come from PigChamp and use that work then efficiently.
Very good. And could you give us a brief background of the facilities and systems in place here in Moorpark?
Yeah, so Moorpark here is a research facility. It's a 200 sow unit and we work on a 3-week batch system. So our batch system goes from farrowing, weaning to service and repeats every 3 weeks. This gives us approximately 7 batches of sows, and we have around 28 to 30 sows per batch for service. Currently our farrowing rate is 96%, so of those 28 to 30 being served, we're getting 27 to 28 farrowing down. And then on site we have 62 farrowing crates, divided up into 6 different rooms. So we've 3 that have 14 crates, 2 that have 7 crates, and 1 that has 6 crates. And the room that has the 6 crates actually are freedom crates, freedom farrowing crates. So this allows us to conduct specific trials for this area, and it's kind of a nod to how farrowing is going to go in the future and how we can work with that going down the line. I suppose here on site, with our background on farrowing, our average live born currently is 15.1 and we're weaning out then at approximately 13 piglets per sow. Our average weaning weight is 8.2 to 8.3 kilos.
And could you tell us a bit about how you induce sows here and why you find it beneficial?
Yeah, so I suppose with our batch system, our sows come over to our farrowing houses on the Friday before farrowing week. So that is 110 days gestation. And that would give us a gestation length of 116 days the following Thursday. So our average gestation length here in Moorpark is 115.8 days approximately. So for us, then we're able to use that information to induce 24 hours beforehand. So for here, that's inducing early on the Wednesday morning for farrowing on the Thursday morning. We use a synthetic prostaglandin such as Indupar or Plan 8. This is given, it's usually around 2 mils, is given deep IM injection into the neck region. And generally we see them farrowing within 24 hours of this. I suppose the main thing here with this is knowing what your average gestation length is here, and that ties back with accurately recording our information from service and all the way up. So one way of doing that is these sow cards that we have on site. This information is given from PigChamp, which is a history of the sow, and then everything that happens in farrowing is recorded here, from fostering on, fostering off, piglet deaths, when the sow farrowed, and how much she farrowed. So by having all that information accurately, we know that we're inducing correctly and at the right time. Otherwise, then you can run into areas of difficulty by inducing too early, and then you could have weak piglets being born, or a higher percentage of mortality or stillborns occurring. I suppose an advantage that we see of inducing is having labour on site when the sows are farrowing. So by giving that induction 24 hours before they're due, we have a condensed farrowing, and this allows for our farm staff to know that the sows are going to be farrowing between those hours. They're there on site, they can assist with any sows that get stuck or have difficulty farrowing, any piglets that are that bit weaker and need to be revived, any cross fostering that can occur, because there is that large amount of sows all farrowing at the same time. If any need to be cross fostered, the availability is there. So these are the huge advantages that we see with it here. I suppose overall, since inducing, we've seen a higher percentage of live-born piglets, and then we also have seen an increase in our piglets weaned out as well.
Brilliant. So that was a quick overview there from Aisling about some of the key husbandry practices that are carried out on the Moorpark unit around farrowing. And Michael, I might begin by asking you, because of the batch system that Moorpark use, or indeed for any commercial farms out there that are using the same system, is the inducing of sows a more effective route to follow? For example, we know that with a batch system, we don't have sows or piglets coming in the week before or the week after. So by inducing, are you condensing the system and making the whole operation more effective?
Yes, thank you, Louise, for that question. Okay, in a 3-week batch system, obviously what you're trying to do is that you're trying to farrow down all into 1 week, and then obviously later on you'll be weaning all into 1 week. So unlike a conventional system where you're farrowing down every week, you're condensing all the farrowings into the 1 week. So from a synchronization point of view, it's better to try and synchronize them all into the 1 week, and from an inducing point of view then as well, you're trying to minimize the farrowing. So you have all of the sows farrowing down within a short period of time, and therefore for cross fostering, it makes it much easier as well, because there are a lot more sows available. And from a labor point of view, it's much easier. So instead of having 1 or 2 people in the farrowing house, you now have the whole team in the farrowing house for the week. And this definitely will give a lot of synergies and help performance. It's especially useful for smaller units where labor might be an issue, or where there might be different enterprises on the unit, like maybe dairying or something like that, where you can get everybody in to the farrowing house on the 1 week.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Michael. And Michael, I'm actually going to stick with you again there. I was speaking to a client during the week, and he had a question in terms of low viability with farms that are inducing sows. So I suppose as a farmer, as an advisor going out on farm, have you come across an issue in terms of low viability?
Inducing sows is very unit specific, but it may be worth your while to try it and see if it suits your unit. The most important factor of inducing sows is you need to make sure that your gestation time is correct. So over the last number of years, the average gestation time has increased from maybe 113 days, 114 days. It's now up to 115 days, especially with some of the genetics there where the born alive is a lot higher. So the first thing you need to do is look back over your records and just see over the last number of months what your average gestation length is. And if it's 115 days, then that will dictate when you go in to induce the sows, or even if it's 116 days in some units, that then will dictate when to induce the sows. If you go in too early, it will increase your problem with low viability pigs, because you will have what commercial farmers would call soft pigs, that the pig is perfectly formed, but there's no viability to the pig. It's just very weak and very soft. So you really need to get your gestation time right. If you can get that right, it means then from a labor point of view, all of your pigs are born in the one day, so it's easier to do your cross fostering, but also to give the attention to the small pigs is much better. So it really is unit specific, but definitely it's worth trying on your unit to see if it's something that will help your low viabilities.
That's great, Michael. Thanks very much. So I suppose as we have a number of video clips to get through today, we're now going to move on to the second area, which focuses on weaning and some of the key husbandry practices that are carried out on the Teagasc Pig unit. So in this clip, we will hear from Tomas Ryan, farm manager, who will talk us through how pigs are managed at weaning.
Hi Tomas, thanks for talking to us about how you manage pigs at weaning here in the unit. Could you give a brief description of how you do it here in Moore Park?
I suppose just to recap on the basics first, it's a 200 sow facility and we run a batch system, so we wean our piglets here every 3 weeks. So typically we're looking at probably about 28 to really 30 litres to be weaned. Now our room configuration here in Moore Park lends itself quite well to that. We have 30 pens per room and each pen is designed to take roughly about 14 pigs. So we can wean intact litters essentially into every pen, which is what our aim is. So when weaning day comes, we transfer our intact litters down to the pens in a barrow. We don't walk them down the corridors. The new unit here in Moore Park is great from a space point of view because some of our weaner rooms are next door to our farrowing pens, and others are typically the maximum transfer distance will probably be about 80 to 100 meters. So the barrow system works well and allows us to capture full litter weight at weaning as well, which is important for us. So the pigs are then lifted out of the barrow at their pen. All the essential information is brought with the litter, so the sow ID and their weaning weight is put on, and the number weaned, etc. is there at that point. And we transfer the pigs into the pen and they're vaccinated at that point, and then that really kind of concludes our weaning system.
So that seems quite different than what would happen on a commercial unit. Why do you not move the pigs to the weaner house and grade them by size?
Yes, well I suppose, yeah, it is quite different, and I suppose as a unit we are quite different to a commercial unit too. We have a research responsibility as well. So why we carried out this way, I suppose, is two-pronged really. It's to support our research that we do. Our research really works well based on the model of weaning intact litters. But also, I suppose, research has really shown, I suppose, that grading your pigs really is terming it a waste of time is a bit crude, but it's a poor use of labour really, and I suppose there isn't really any gains to be achieved from it from a standpoint of growth and unit and efficiencies. So yeah, we would typically wean intact litters because I suppose the research has shown that it doesn't improve performance, and pigs of a similar age will probably fight more to establish a pecking order, I suppose, whereas pigs of different sizes will not fight as much and will settle down much more quickly. Obviously, in our situation, being an intact litter, that's another stress that we have removed from the system here in Moore Park, which is great. The weaning time, I suppose, to recap, it's an extremely stressful time for piglets, moving away from the mother, moving from a predominantly liquid diet to a solid diet. So anything you can do to really remove those extra stressors at that time can only aid in weaning success.
Would you say that all grading then is a waste of time?
No, not all grading. It has its merits in certain places. Certainly, like from gilt progeny point of view, and also obviously from animals that would be used to go on to be reproductive breeding animals in the unit as well. But from a gilt progeny point of view, there's a merit in grading those animals, and I suppose the lighter, maybe 15-20% of the weaning, there is a merit in grading those animals to size too. Certainly efficiencies have been shown in that as regards to, I suppose, reducing weight variance on the week's average weaning weight.
So do you think that minimising grading will reduce this variation on its own?
It's an important step, but I suppose what you do pre-weaning is also quite important, and in some respects, some of the work and some of the efforts put in pre-weaning have quite a profound effect post-weaning. So I suppose the main thing would be trying to increase your average weaning weight or age, up to 28 to 30 days. A low average weaning age down around the 25, 26 days will only lead to an increased variation, all right. From a cross-fostering point of view, try to eliminate all cross-fostering really outside the 24-hour window. Only in extreme scenarios of really hungry piglets or injured piglets should cross-fostering take place. What it does is it actually, I suppose, upsets the sow's milk production and delivery to the piglets, and I suppose it also has the effect of reducing the average daily gain of those faster growing piglets also. Very important, of course, not to wean piglets under 3 weeks of age. The, I suppose, immature digestive system of the pig at that age, they really don't have enough enzymes to break down the food. So although they eat the food, much of it will pass through the piglet undigested, and the piglet will lose weight rapidly. So it's age that really takes preference there over weight. A 4 week, say 6 kilo piglet will perform much better than a 6.5 kilo 3 week old piglet.
So the system seems to work very well here at Moore Park, but obviously this is a research facility. So how can a commercial unit adapt some of these practices?
Moving each litter, I suppose, would not be practical from a commercial standpoint, from a commercial unit, because of the numbers of litters that are being weaned. As I said, we're typically weaning a maximum of 30 litters every 3 weeks, so it's quite feasible for us here to take the extra time and care in doing it the way we do it. It also has direct benefits from our research point of view as well. But I think some of the principles can still really be adapted from what we do here to the bigger upscale commercial facilities. So I suppose the main point is don't sort all the piglets. It's a waste of time, it's a waste of labour, and it'll only have the effect of maybe reducing performance. The gilt progeny and the lightest 15-20% of the weaning would be where the focus should be put on grading the piglets at weaning. We're quite lucky here because our pen sizes are typically designed around an intact litter for us, around the 14 pigs. If a commercial unit has the facility to wean in multiples of a litter size, like 26 or 39 piglets, 2 or 3 litters, there may be benefit in removing pen divisions maybe 24 hours pre-weaning and allowing the mingling or co-mixing of those piglets in advance of weaning, as they will be mixed the next day. It will certainly remove one element of stress in advance of the weaning day itself if they have had an opportunity to mix.
Is there any other advice that you would offer?
I suppose just to recap really, not to forget those pre-weaning rules. The most important step really for weaning is what you do pre-weaning. So try to really achieve weaning age up at the 28-29 days mark. Certainly do not wean piglets at 3 weeks of age. As we said, size is not the metric you want to be working on there, it's age as regards digestive systems and maturity. And try where you can, I suppose, to really only cross-foster outside of a 24-hour window for pigs in extreme need of it, i.e. a very hungry pig or an injured pig. Otherwise, cross-fostering to occur within 24 hours of birth.
So as Tomas highlighted, or he gave us a really good insight into what happens in terms of the weaning practice that's carried out on the Moore Park unit. And I suppose, as he did mention, it's a little different to commercial units out there, and he gave the reasons behind this. But I suppose one of the points he did mention, Michael, was the grading of pigs. And I know this is an area that you would have covered previously at the Teagasc Pig Conference a number of years ago. And I suppose my question to you is, from that time to now, have you noticed any improvement on farm, or are farmers still persisting in grading pigs? And if so, I suppose, what advice would you give to them farmers that still seem to have a bit of the Evenitis bug?
Yeah, we spoke about it, I think, in 2015, and it was really just to draw attention to the whole thing of people really selecting the pigs at weaning into very, very small categories, and they're spending a huge amount of time, like an hour and a half or 2 hours, trying to wean it by weight, so you have all the different sections the whole way down. All we wanted the people to do is to question, why are they doing it, and are they getting a performance response to doing it, as opposed to making the pigs look nice in the pens, that they're all nice and even, but is there a performance response? So, and that's the same thing we're asking now. So if you're going to certainly separate the bottom 15%, that's no problem at all, and try and give them higher nutrition or more care, that's brilliant. Even if you wanted to do the top 15%, that's no problem either. If you're going to put them onto say less creep and more onto link a lot earlier, that's no problem. But if you're separating the pigs, you must be doing it for a specific reason, and it must be performance linked. Because if you do a huge amount of separation there, you might think it's going to reduce your variation of slaughter, but actually it has very little effect. Once you take the bottom 15% out of it, the rest of the variation for slaughter is not really dictated at first stage weaning. It's later on it'll have more of an effect on it.
That's fantastic, Michael. Thanks a million. So just a reminder, if you have any questions you'd like me to ask Michael or indeed Peadar, you can type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're now going to move on to the area of feeding. And in the next video clip, we will hear from Peadar Lawler, who spoke to Orla Kinane about liquid feeding and the advantages and disadvantages around this system, and also how best to optimize feed efficiency on this system.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about liquid feeding and maybe some of the pluses and minuses to liquid feeding and how we can optimize feed efficiency on liquid feed systems.
And what are some of the advantages and disadvantages then of liquid feeding?
Well, I suppose a lot of units would have introduced liquid feeding historically because of the accuracy of feeding. This would have been years ago, maybe over 20, 30 years ago, when these systems were installed on units. This is because they're computerized systems, you have feed curves built into them, so they more accurately deliver the quantity of feed that the pig requires. I suppose the other thing is that your dry matter intake is higher with liquid feeding. Because of that, you have higher growth rates. So that would be important. I suppose the biggest advantage I would see with liquid feeding is the fact that you can use liquid byproducts and you can use those as ingredients in your diet to cheapen that diet and reduce your feed cost per kilo dead weight. Another advantage might be the reduction in dust. The fact that you actually mix the feed with water means that you have a less dusty environment, and it's more healthy for the animals but also for the stock people. Historically, a lot of these would have been installed as a labour saving means because they're computerized, and particularly around the time of feeding there's less labour involved. But as we'll see later, maybe some of the dry feed systems are quite labour saving currently as well. An advantage of liquid feeding is that you can feed different diets to different pens. In other words, you could phase feed, or you could feed your males and your females differently to optimize their feed efficiencies and growth. That's an advantage of liquid feeding that's not always utilised on Irish units. I suppose the last advantage would be, and it's probably a principal one, in that a lot of units put liquid feed systems in because the mixing tank can be used to mix ingredients together to form a diet, and it would have been installed for that purpose where home milling operated on a unit. So that was an advantage of liquid feeding. But I suppose some of the disadvantages then, and the principal one that I would see currently, is that there is reduced feed efficiency on liquid feed systems compared to dry feeding systems. And principally one of the reasons at least that occurs is because there's uncontrolled fermentation occurring in pipelines and occurring in troughs where feed resides. And that would be particularly the case with short trough feeding systems, where there's always a reservoir of feed within the trough. And you're in a hot environment, the feed has been mixed with water, so the bugs that are inherent in the feed are going to grow and multiply. So you get things like yeast blooms, but you get growth of bacteria and molds. Because these bacteria are growing, they have to feed on something. So they'll feed on the amino acids, the expensive amino acids that you're after putting into your balancer diet. So your crystalline amino acids, the likes of lysine, HCl, methionine and threonine, they all get used up by the bugs. So you're left with I suppose a less nutritious diet, or a diet that is not as balanced as it was before. I suppose another issue would be, because you're mixing feed with water, and particularly on some of the older units, maybe your water to meal ratios are quite high, and because of that, slurry volumes can be a problem. You're producing more slurry than you would be on a dry feeding system. Allied to that is probably wetter pens. You go on to any unit that has liquid feeding, the pens are wetter, the floors are dirtier, and in some cases the pigs are dirtier, particularly during the summer. Now you have dry feeding systems that are every bit as labour saving, and they're automated and they're computerized. And also you have, I suppose the other advantage with liquid feeding that we mentioned was the fact that you could phase feed or feed different pens, different diets. You can also do this with dry feeding now. So those advantages that were there in the past are no longer there with liquid feeding. I suppose one of the other big disadvantages with liquid feeding, and it varies from unit to unit, depends on whether you have long or short troughs, but it's aggression at feeding times. As soon as you hear the hiss from the valve or at feeding time, you get a race of pigs, no matter whether it's short or long troughs. You'll get a race to the feeder, and there's aggression and there's chances of pigs getting hurt. With long troughs, that's also an issue if you have a shortage of feeding space. If you have too many pigs, maybe you're overstocked slightly, and pigs don't all have time to feed at one time. That can be an issue in the long trough situation.
So what are some of the problems then associated with the spontaneous fermentation during liquid feeding?
I suppose although you get higher feed intakes, and because of that, higher growth rates with liquid feeding, FCE is a problem where you're liquid feeding compared to dry feeding. And I suppose what that suggests, or what it should suggest to you, is that feed is being wasted somewhere. There's a loss of feed. Obviously, if you compare the same feed in liquid or dry form, you would expect that you should be getting similar results. But the fact is you're getting some sort of wastage of nutrients or loss of feed. And there's two types of losses of feed. One is a physical loss, and that could be feed just being pulled out of the trough by the pigs while they're feeding. And you can reduce that to a large extent by installing dividers within your trough to prevent that happening, but also maybe raising your trough off the ground so that there is a step up, and that will help to prevent that pulling out of the feed. But I suppose the other loss is a microbial loss, and that's a loss caused by uncontrolled fermentation. And that's where, as we said before, the bugs that are inherent in your feed, they're there in dry feed, but as soon as you wet that feed and you put that feed into a warm environment, remember the finisher pens are probably 20 degrees, you get a proliferation or a growth of those bugs. And those bugs need a substrate to feed on, so they will feed on the amino acids, but they will also use up energy in the diet. You take, for instance, where there's a bloom of yeast in a trough of feed within a pen. And this happens in short trough ad libitum feeding systems where you have reservoirs of feed sitting there between feeds. You get a bloom of yeast, you can actually see bubbles coming off the feed. That's a growth of yeast. The yeast is creating carbon dioxide. That's a loss of energy. If you actually measure the temperature change, you'll see that the liquid is getting warmer. That's a loss of energy. So energy is being lost. You get some little bit of production of alcohol. It may be important, it may not be, but you have a loss of energy. So your diets are becoming unbalanced. I suppose the other thing is, look, the growth of the bugs can produce, it can be beneficial in some instances. You can produce lactic acid. That's a good thing, right? But what's happening is you're getting an uncontrolled fermentation. And you can get this destruction of the amino acids. With that, you can get the formation of things like biogenic amines, which are potentially hazardous to the pigs.
So from work on liquid feeding, it would appear that feed efficiency is poorer with this system. What can be done to improve this?
I suppose the first thing that I would suggest that you do is that if you're feeding pigs, you mix up your feed with water, your dry feed with water, immediately prior to feeding. In other words, you don't have it sitting there in a mixing tank. You don't have it maybe sent to a satellite tank where it's sitting maybe for 12 hours and feeding out at various different intervals, because uncontrolled fermentation is occurring. I suppose another thing that we can do with the short trough feeding system is that you install dividers in your troughs, and that will prevent your pigs physically pulling feed out of the troughs. Also, we mentioned before the step up. In Moore Park, we have troughs sitting on floor level. That's not a particularly good system. So in a new project that is just starting, we will look at raising those troughs off the ground and giving a step up to the pigs to prevent them pulling feed out of the trough. Specifically, again, with sensor type feeding or the ad libitum short trough feeding, your sensor position is sort of critical, right? Because it will determine how much feed can come into the trough or resides in the trough. So what I would suggest is, if you have a problem with feed efficiency, that you actually lower the sensors, and you might do this on a gradual basis, lower the sensors and feed more splits per day. And that should help to ensure that you have less feed residing for any period of time within the troughs. Now, another thing that is quite beneficial in terms of wet feeding is to add organic acids to the diet, right? We did a few trials on this in Moore Park in the last couple of years, and one of the acids that we looked at was benzoic acid. Benzoic acid is it's a feed additive in the food industry, and it's particularly used to try and reduce the growth of yeast, and yeast can be a problem with liquid feed. So we said to ourselves, this is going to be an acid that has potential with liquid feeding. In fact, when we looked at the results, we got very, very little benefit from including the benzoic acid. However, in a subsequent trial, we looked at a blend of acids. So that's a mixture of different types of acids, but critical, I would say, is that blend of acid contained formic acid. And when we fed that in the diet, we got improvements in feed efficiency and in growth rate in our liquid fed pigs.
Could you tell us then a little bit about maybe why feed efficiency is poorer with liquid feeding?
Yeah, I suppose maybe the best place to start on this is to go back to maybe a survey that we did as part of Fiona O'Mara's thesis. We went on to 8 different farms and we took samples of feed there. They were all liquid feeding, and we did surveys on those farms. And I suppose what we were looking for is to look at the microbial quality of the feed on those farms and how it was affected by different management practices on the units. But I suppose what we did find is, all of those units thought they were feeding fresh liquid feed. None of them assumed that they were fermenting their feed. But when we looked at the feed, we took samples from the mixing tank, we took samples from troughs in different sites around the house. But when you looked at the feed that was in the troughs, it had actually undergone spontaneous fermentation. There was increases in lactic acid bacteria, in yeasts and molds, in E. coli. So there was contamination even coming from the pigs that were within the pens. So spontaneous fermentation had occurred. We took samples again and we analysed for amino acids. We found losses in amino acids, particularly lysine, and the crystalline amino acids, or the free amino acids that are added into the diet. We found losses of those. Lysine could be lost, you could have maybe 25-30% loss of free lysine in the diet. You also had losses or reductions in gross energy in the diet, from the dry feed to the wet feed. So really you had an unbalanced diet. Your diet had deteriorated in nutritional quality by the time it was being consumed by the pigs. I suppose, like one of the other things, Orla, that we looked at was hygiene practices or sanitation on units. And the idea there was, look, if we have good hygiene or sanitation practices, well, hopefully the microbial quality of the feed will be better, right? I suppose, you know, if you look at the practices that were applied on some of these farms, they varied quite a lot. They varied from as little maybe as washing the trough every now and then to rinsing the system with an organic acid, right? But what we did find was, regardless, these sanitation practices had very, very little effect on the microbial quality of the feed. In fact, what we did find is when we looked at units that were using some of the liquid byproducts, the likes of liquid whey and potato syrup, we found that the microbial quality was more influenced by the likes of those ingredients than by the sanitation practices. In fact, microbial quality was improved by having the liquid byproducts included in the diet.
Okay.
Now, I suppose the issue with regard to feed efficiency, and why is feed efficiency poor? Feed efficiency is poor simply because you're getting this uncontrolled spontaneous fermentation occurring. It's reducing the amount of amino acids in the diet. It's reducing the energy in the diet. So the pig isn't taking in the same amount of nutrients per kilo of feed, and for that reason feed efficiency is poor in lots of cases with liquid feeding. The most important thing I would say is that if you are using a liquid feed system, you have a liquid feed system there, you should be, when you're feeding your pigs, you should have just mixed freshly your feed prior to feeding. You should ensure, if you have short troughs ad libitum wet feeding, you should ensure that feed resides in those troughs for as short a period as possible. And one way to do that would be to drop the level of the sensor in the trough and maybe feed your diet more frequently, feed a greater number of splits per day. I would also look seriously, if you don't have dividers in your troughs, put them in, and that'll help to prevent physical wastage of feed. And also maybe adding a step up. If you have troughs that are at floor level, raise them. Make it a little bit more difficult for the pigs to pull feed out of the trough. And by doing those little things, you will optimize your feed efficiency. You already have huge growth rates on liquid feeding systems, but you need to improve feed efficiency.
Okay, so that was a really excellent overview, Peadar. Thank you very much. And I'm sure there's loads of points there that farmers using the wet feed system will be able to apply to their system. But I suppose one question I have for you, if you're a farmer and you're considering putting in a new system in the morning, would you recommend going for a dry feed system or a wet feed system, and why would you do so?
Okay, that's a great question, Louise. I suppose the answer to this depends on many different factors. And maybe starting at the beginning, you have to decide, are you going to be purchasing feed or are you home compounding? And if you're purchasing pelleted feed, would be the option as far as I'm concerned. If you're purchasing feed, go with pelleted feed and feed the pellets through wet-dry feeders. In this instance, you would get the benefit of the pelleting that will optimize your feed efficiency, but you will also get growth rates that are comparable to that of wet feeding. However, the situation changes if you're home compounding. And here you have to ask yourself a question also. You have to ask yourself, do I have a consistent ready supply of cheap liquid byproducts or other byproducts or co-products such as bakery waste available to me locally? And you know, if that is the case, it's a no-brainer. You go with liquid feeding because you use those type of ingredients to cheapen your diet and to reduce your feed cost per kilo dead weight. If you don't have those type of byproducts available to you, the situation changes. In that instance, I would definitely opt for a dry feeding system. And this type of system I would opt for because it's easier to manage, first of all, and it'll be less costly to install. And if I was to put in a dry feeding system, an automated dry feeding system, the type of feeder that I would opt for is either hoppers or wet dry feeders. and I would choose the feeder type that allows me to feed the meal without the need for excessive intervention. So a feeder type that will optimize your feed efficiency and reduce wastage.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Pater. There were some really valid points there mentioned in your answer that I'm sure some farmers will be able to take on board if they're considering putting in a new system in the morning. So just to make sure that we've enough time at the end for questions, we're now going to move on to our last video clip of the day. And sticking with feed, we will hear from Edgar Garcia, who spoke to Orla in relation to particle size and the importance of particle size on digestibility.
Hello everyone. Today we are going to be talking about something very simple that can give you important benefits in terms of digestibility of your feed and growth of your animals. We are talking about particle size.
So Edgar, what ingredients would you recommend to check for particle size?
Particle size is something that we normally recommend for home millers, and home millers normally have a limited number of beans in their farms. That's why we analyze a small list of ingredients, mainly wheat, barley, maize since last year, and soybean meal. In the picture, you can see, for example, soybean meal on the right with before milling and on the left after milling. And you can see clearly before milling that there is particles that probably will be difficult to digest for a young animal. When we get a sample like this, what we do is to run the sample through a series of sieves, and then we calculate the percentage of particles for each size, and we calculate the average particle size. We can see, for example, here in this sample, 35% of the particles are in the sieve of 500 microns. For you to have an idea, 500 microns is half a millimeter, 1000 microns is 1 millimeter. Apart from the size, the average size of the particles, it's important to consider the variability of those particles. You can have the same average size, but have problems because you have too many big particles that will be difficult to digest for the animal, and too many small particles that result in dust and dirtiness and sometimes even ulcers. So it's important to have as condensed size as possible. In this particular sample, which is the soy that we saw in the picture, we can see that we have probably too many big particles above 1 millimeter, because soy is something that can be milled easily to have all the particles below 1 millimeter. And then we also have too many particles that are in the smallest size. That's going to result in probably dust, dirtiness, and as I said, probably ulcers at some point. For farmers, this analysis can be a little bit difficult to perform, but we have a simple version of these sieves that you can see in the picture, and that's the one that some farmers use in Ireland. And this has three different particle sizes. It's less than 1 millimeter on the right, between 1 and 2, and then over 2 millimeters. So typically what you wouldn't want is, especially for soy, to have particles above 2 millimeters. For soy, as I say, any particle between 1 and 2 millimeters shouldn't be there. And for soy, all the particles should be below 1 millimeter. For other ingredients, you could have particles that are between 1 and 2 millimeters, and then it's fine because they are more fibrous, or depending on the diet that you want to do.
Thanks, Edgar. So what then are the main diets that we should be considering?
So when we start working with any farmer, what we do initially is to test all the diets to see where we are coming from. But then the most important diet probably to keep an eye on is the weaner diet. Why? You see this picture here is the diet for a weaner with big particles that we had added water in a tube. And then you see the contents of the stomach, the cecum, and the feces of that particular animal. In the feces, you can still see some of the big particles floating, which means that those particles have not been digested by the animal, and the nutrients, the energy and the protein have not been extracted and used by the animal. So that's what we want to avoid, that the animal can actually use all the ingredients that is in the diet.
And can we check the particle size then in pelleted feed?
Yes, we can do the analysis from a pelleted feed, but there is two reasons why probably we don't do it. The first one is that most of the big mills have quality control systems in place to test particle size and pellet hardness. And so it will be very strange to have a pellet that has a bad quality in terms of particle size of hardness. Apart from that, pelleting in itself reduces the particle size, so it's normally even smaller than for any meal that is produced. So for that reason, from a supplier point of view, I wouldn't recommend it. And from a laboratory point of view, the analysis takes a lot of time because we have to basically dismantle the pellet by putting it in water, like in this picture, and then run it through the sieves. So it takes much more time than for a meal sample. And that's the main points that I wanted to summarize in terms of particle size. So keep the samples coming whenever you want. And remember that we need for this analysis between 500 and 500 grams or 1 kilo of feed, and that it has to be representative of the batch that you are trying to analyze. So try to make it as good as sampling as possible. Thank you very much for the attention. Bye.
So Edgar has discussed the importance of feed particle size, and this is something that you can test for on your own unit and is strongly recommended for home millers to do so regularly. So this is a typical feed sieve. They are available to purchase, and the feed sieve is split into 3 separate compartments divided by 2 different screen sizes. So you end up with less than 1 millimetre, 1 to 2 millimetre and greater than 2 millimetre particle size. So once we have sieved our sample, the contents will lie in one of each of these 3 compartments. So like I said, it is strongly recommended to regularly test the particle size of your diets. Firstly, because of the close relationship between feed conversion efficiency and particle size, and secondly, for home millers, regularly checking the particle size is a very good aid in determining when feed mill equipment requires maintenance. So without any further ado, I'm going to do a quick demonstration on how we sift this sample of weaner ration. So we take our sample and we're popping it into the largest compartment of the sieve and filling it to the line indicated at the front of the sieve. So once the feed sample is filled to the line indicated at the front of the sieve, we turn it onto its side and we shake for 2 minutes. So after 2 minutes of shaking our feed sample, the results are in, and this sample has come in here with a reading of 70% in less than 1 millimetre, or in section 1. We have got 30% in section 2, or sized 1 to 2 millimetre of particles, and we really only have residue in the 3rd section across here. So for weaners and finishers, it is recommended to have a split 60-40 between sections 1, which like I said is less than 1 millimetres, and section 2. So this sample is comfortably where we'd like to see it. It would be quite different for sows. Just to prevent gastric ulcers, you'd rather have a sample of 50% in section 1, 35% in section 2 and 15% in section 3, or greater than 2 millimetres. So that's a very simple run through of how to use the sieve. It is recommended to do this at least once a week across your diets on your farm. I suppose when we think about it, we spend so much money feeding our pigs, we might just spend a little bit of time analysing our samples. It is well worth it in the long run. Perfect, so that was the last of our video clips for today, and now we're just going to spend the remainder of the time trying to get through some of the questions. So without further delay, Michael, I might bring you back in on this question if that's okay. I suppose one of the questions in terms of Ashleen's video was, why is inducing of the sows done intramuscularly, as opposed to via the vulva?
Yeah, you can do it either way. Obviously, I'm not a vet, but from my own experience, if you put it in the intravulvar, you're going to get a very short, sharp burst. So it's a much higher concentration, but it'll only last a shorter period of time. Whereas if you put it into the neck, it will be a larger dose you will need, but it's a slower release in the body, in the bloodstream. So therefore, it'll last longer in the bloodstream. And therefore, from an inducing point of view, you're looking for a nice steady approach to it to start the start of the farrowing. Whereas the other way, it'll be short and high, but it may or may not induce farrowing. There is a good paper for anyone who who's not able to sleep at night. It's called the Induction, I think, of the Sow. It was out in 2012, and that goes through the different methods and the different ways of doing it, whether in the vulva or in the neck. But generally, it's the same. The neck is probably preferred. It's a slower release, and it's the same thing where you have contractions in the farrowing house. If you give it in the neck, it is a slower, longer release, whereas if you give it in the vulva, it's a much faster but shorter lasted release.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Peadar, there's a question there just in terms of the long trough or the short trough. I suppose, what is your preference on this?
I suppose personally, Louise, I have a personal preference for the long trough, and it's only a personal preference really. And the reason for it is that I like to be able to see all the pigs eating at the same time. It's a good chance for stockmen or whatever to be able to see a pig that's not eating, or maybe a pig that's going off form. So that it's only a personal preference. But I suppose another advantage of the long trough is that you have better feed efficiency on it than you have on the short ad libitum troughs. And the reason for that is that on the long troughs, you feed the pigs restricted. You restrict their feed intake. But I suppose as against that, your feed efficiency is better, but your growth rate would be poorer on the long troughs as opposed to the short ad libitum troughs. And I suppose putting my personal preference aside, it should be possible for us to take advantage of that increased growth rate on the short troughs. I suppose we just need to tackle a few things. We talked about it in the video, reducing physical wastage by making it more difficult for the pig to pull feed out of the trough, but also preventing large reservoirs of feed from building up in pipelines and sitting in satellite tanks and in mixing tanks, so as to avoid as much of the uncontrolled fermentation as possible occurring. And I suppose another issue or reason why these short troughs might be more advantageous on Irish units is because a lot of our units currently are highly stocked. And I suppose we're under pressure to achieve target slaughter weights in a reduced amount of time. And if we have increased growth rates with these short troughs, well, then we should be trying to capitalize on that. So in that particular scenario, the short trough system is advantageous because of the higher growth rates.
Perfect, thank you very much. Michael, I might direct this question at you if you don't mind. Do Moorpark use any acids or prebiotics in the first stage to help gut health post-weaning?
No, they don't at the moment. You might have seen in the video yesterday, though, in the weaner houses, though, that they have two separate water supply lines. So they can give ordinary water, ordinary clean water on one line, or they can transfer it and they can give some water with some acids in it in the second line. At the moment, we are just giving straight water. We have no trial work at the moment on as regards acids. There is a role for acids in certain circumstances, but the most basic requirement is for clean water, and not just clean water at the source, at the well, but clean water actually the whole way through the pipework. So it's well worth your while to test the water from the water actually that the pig is drinking, as opposed to the water at the well source.
Perfect, thank you very much. Peadar, just one there in terms of spontaneous fermentation. How would a farmer know if they are getting spontaneous fermentation? Is there any method or any analysis that they can carry out on farm for this?
Yeah, look, I think you can almost take it as a given that there's some level of spontaneous fermentation occurring when you're liquid feeding pigs. You mix that feed with water, the bugs become active at that stage, and they're going to start working on the substrate, the starch and the amino acids that are in the diet. So it's virtually impossible to prevent some level of fermentation, unless maybe you heavily acidified your diet with organic acids or whatever. But that's expensive, and you may run into palatability issues if you over acidify your diet as well. I suppose a simple thing that you could look out for, and if you're seeing this or seeing bubbling of feed in your troughs or in a satellite tank or a mixing tank, that's, as we said in the video, that's yeast growing. It's a bloom of yeast. and it's carbon dioxide that's been released, and that is a surefire indication that you have fermentation occurring. With that, you'll also get a change in the smell or the odor from the feed, and sometimes it smells a bit like gone off beer or a brewery type smell, you know. If you wanted to get more technical than that, I suppose what happens during fermentation, if there's both the lactic acid bacteria that grow during the fermentation process, they produce lactic acid, and some of them actually produce acetic acid as well, right? And for that reason, as fermentation progresses, you're going to get your diet becomes more acidic, or you're going to get a reduction in pH over time. So you could check the pH of the liquid feed in your mixing tank. You could then check it in your trough. And if there is a difference, in other words, if pH has dropped between the mixing tank and the trough, well, then that's a surefire indication fermentation has occurred. The higher the drop, the greater the drop that has occurred, the more fermentation has occurred. So you could measure that pH using something as simple as litmus strips that give an indication of the pH, or you could invest in a portable pH meter. They're quite inexpensive currently.
Perfect, thanks a million. So I think we might have just time for one more quick question. And just in terms of Emer's video there, Michael, and she used the sieve. There's a question in, where can you buy such a sieve? Do you any idea?
The sieve that was shown there is Blyglorm, I think it is. It's Bygholm. Apologies, my Danish is a bit rusty, but it's a Danish sieve that is used commonly in Denmark. So speak to your equipment supplier on that, and they're readily available. Just on the sieve is very important for home millers. As Emer mentioned, the minimum you're looking for finisher feed is 60% under 1 mil and 40% from 1 to 2 and none above 2. But for every 100 mils that you get, every 10% that you get at 0 to 1, that will have an effect on your feed conversion. So if you go from 70% to 80% under 1 mil and 20% from 1 to 2 mil, that can improve your feed conversion by 0.05. So in other words, it can improve it going from 2.65, for example, down to 2.6. But you just need to be aware of that the risk of gastric ulcers may increase as you go to a finer and finer grind. But it's something all home millers should have. They should be doing it on a weekly basis.
Perfect, thanks a million. Okay, so unfortunately, it looks like the clock is against us again today. So I would like to finish off by thanking, firstly, everyone in the pig department for their contribution, with a special thanks to Orla Knane for all her hard work in putting this week together. I'd also like to thank a massive thank you to our panel today, so Michael McKeown and Peadar Lawler, and also our video presenters, so Aisling, Tomas, Edgar and Emer. I'd also like to thank Michelle Lavelle in Connect Ed, Alison Maloney, Eric Donald, and all in PR. And lastly, I would like to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in and for all your questions. I hope that you found it an informative afternoon. And just a reminder that today's session and all the other sessions will be available on the Teagasc website early next week. So we'll hope you join us again tomorrow at the same time of 1:30 for day 3, where the focus will be on biosecurity and energy use. And we'll also be taking part in a virtual farm visit to Eugene and Kieran Sheehan's pig farm in County Cork. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us and stay safe.